Hello, everyone. It's another edition of the 007 Files. I'm Bill Koenig, along with Javi Trujillo. And today we are talking with Steven Jay Rubin, who has written books about the James Bond films, has his own podcast. And Steve, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. I assume I'm talking to James Bond fans. I certainly consider myself one. I have two podcasts now. One is called Steven Jay Rubin, Saturday Night at the Movies. And then I co-host Tales from Hollywood Land, which is a podcast I share with my producing friends Julian Schlossberg and Arthur E. Friedman. Definitely having a lot of fun with the Bond world these days, but I'm also a working screenwriter in LA. I write comedy, and we're out there trying to sell comedy in a world that doesn't seem to want any comedy.
Let me preface this interview by saying in the early 1980s, I have written that James Bond fandom matured somewhat. And I think there were three things in particular that helped that. One was Steve's book, The James Bond Films, first published in 1981 and then updated in 1983. Another was a Starlog magazine feature about Richard Maibaum that was published in 1983. And the third thing was the James Bond Bedside Companion by Raymond Benson in 1984, which was updated a few years later. I think from that point onward, I think Bond fandom wanted more than it was getting, and it got it and starting with Steve's book. So, Steve, could you describe just how the James Bond film project began? Because you recently posted something on Facebook. It was a 1977 interview you had with Cubby Broccoli, and it's fascinating. I watched the whole video, but let's start there. How did that develop?
Well, after graduating from UCLA with a history degree, I'd been a reporter for the Daily Bruin, got my feet wet with writing. I decided to write a book, and I spent about 4 years researching a book called Combat Films, American Realism, 1945 to 1970. I interviewed a lot of filmmakers who made the great World War II movies and did a lot of original research at the Motion Picture Academy. And when McFarlane published it in 81, it sold 500 copies. And I realized that if I wanted to be a truly working writer, I needed to find a topic that was more universal than combat films. So I'd been a big James Bond fan from the get-go, and I decided to test the waters and by the way, at that time I had been a staff writer for Cinefantastique magazine in Chicago. And essentially what I'd been perfecting were a series of historical researched essays on classic 1950s science fiction films. And they got me my first attention. One of my first articles was on the making of The Day the Earth Stood Still, the original 1951 classic. And my God, I got a letter from Leonard Maltin, of all people, and who was a god to me. His film guide was something I used every day, and he said how excited he was about the research I'd done. Original research interviewing the original filmmakers. So rather than write stories about the making of films using everybody else's research, I decided to do my own stuff. In fact, Fred dubbed me a film archaeologist in a way. So the years passed, and then I realized that no one had really done a behind-the-scenes history of the James Bond movies. I was a fan of John Brosnan's book, James Bond in the Cinema, which was published in England in the 70s, but it was basically an overview of the series. There was not a lot of original research there. So knowing the way these things begin, you start at the top. I approached Cubby Broccoli, and I got in the door. I told him I had done this research into World War II movies. I was a serious researcher. I wasn't trying to exploit things. And you heard the interview I did with him back in 1977, although the audio quality, my voice sounds like I'm about 16 years old, but Cubby sounded great. And the biggest thing that happened is he offered to introduce me to Michael Wilson in London that summer, because I was heading over to do my research. And Michael could not have been more charming. And he opened the files for me. I had access to every call sheet on the first 10 movies. Now, call sheets are a key factor in determining how movies are made, because they give you kind of a daily diary of what they were shooting, who was playing who, and there was lots of interesting little behind the scenes details. So that got me very excited. And then I went around London for a couple months, just interviewing as many people as I could find. They had just wrapped The Spy Who Loved Me. So unfortunately, I couldn't get on the Jonah set because the Jonah set was gone. But I got to see the movie, The Spy Who Loved Me, with Ken Adam and with Michael, the first edited cut of it. And that was very exciting for me. The Spy Who Loved Me, as you recall, was a big event movie for that summer. So that's how it all began, and which later became the book, The James Bond Films, A Behind the Scenes History. And as some of your fans know, I've gone on to do 4 editions of the James Bond Movie Encyclopedia.
Right. Javi, I'm sure you have some questions. Let's turn it over to you.
Yeah, as someone who was born in June of 1977, I didn't see that Spy Who Loved Me phenomenon that you're talking about. But since you've been there from the jump, like what you call like golden era for Bond, like I know Thunderball and Goldfinger had a huge impact on pop culture and society. And I'm assuming we saw that again with that combo of Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. Have you seen any burst in the fandom in the mainstream since like the Roger Moore era? Did anything recollect to those earlier times?
Well, I think that the Pierce Brosnan movies were successful, but I don't know if they got people as excited as they would get later with Daniel Craig. I think the big burst came with the release of the Casino Royale movie in 2006. I think that we were a little uncomfortable with the idea of Daniel Craig when he was announced. In fact, we referred to him disparagingly as that blonde Bond. And, you know, we walked into the screening of Casino Royale with not great expectations. That ended about 10 minutes into the movie during that chase where he's chasing the bomber up those gantries and over that construction site. And I have to say that Casino Royale just blew me away. I thought it was, you know, of course, Martin Campbell is a really terrific action director. And I think that propelled the series for the next 15 years. Now, I don't think all of the Daniel Craigs have been as terrific. They've been kind of up and down. As I often say, I think that if you go with a 4-star system, I give Casino Royale 4 stars. I give Quantum of Solace 2 stars. But then I go back to Skyfall, back to 4 stars. And then I go down to Spectre with 2 stars. And then No Time to Die, I don't know. I'm kind of mixed on No Time to Die. I like it, but there's a lot of pushback on No Time to Die. I don't like the way it ended, but you know, that's just my opinion.
Well, let's go back to the James Bond film book, because initially you had cooperation, but then there were some disagreements.
A falling out with a capital F?
Something like that, yeah. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I mean, I've written about this in the past. Essentially, I was so excited about the interviews I had done in Europe with Terrence Young and Peter Hunt, and then in LA with Richard Maibaum. I decided to share the transcripts with Cubby. Big mistake. He did. I think that he started to correct them, saying, "No, that didn't happen that way. This didn't happen that way. That didn't happen that way." And I think he just decided that this was not going to be the kind of book he wanted. I think, listen, Albert R. Broccoli is truly the godfather of James Bondom, and rightfully so. I mean, he basically nurtured the series even more so than Harry Saltzman. I think Harry Saltzman contributed a great deal, and they were true partners. But Harry had a lot of deals going on. If you look at his filmography, while he's making Bond movies, he's also making movies. You know, I think he worked on the Ipcris File. He did Battle of Britain. I mean, he did a lot of different movies. And so he had a bit of an ego. And I think he really wanted the story to be from his point of view. So the fact that Terrence Young and Peter Hunt and Maibaum and 90 other people were commenting, he decided to just walk away. Now, I had finished my research by then. But the problem was that at that time, to illustrate a book on the James Bond films, you needed stills. So I got a threatening letter from United Artists saying that I would not be getting access to any movie stills. which for a film book author is basically a death knell. So I removed 217 photos from the book. I had 6 that they weren't owned by the studio. And it dawned on me that there might be photos that I could get that they weren't owned by UA. Now, interestingly, I went to New York. I went to the Associated Press photo library, and they had all these James Bond movie stills that you could purchase, and they were stamped on the back, official wide world photo. So I basically purchased all the James Bond stills from places like that and filled in gaps. For instance, for the Moonraker chapter, I contacted NASA and got official photos of the space shuttle. Well, that became the Moonraker. So I was able to find another 200 photos that allowed me to illustrate the book in creative ways, but there were enough of the actual official stills to not make it look ridiculous. Now, later on, I discovered, and I didn't know this at the time, that you can't copyright publicity stills. So in 1990, when Contemporary Books of Chicago asked me to do the James Bond Encyclopedia, I went over to London and I just found all sorts of photographic materials. The guy who ran all the stages at Pinewood opened a Foot Locker once, and there were all these behind-the-scenes shots on the sets of the various James Bond movies, which was like a treasure trove. And I borrowed those and made copies. Now, the latest edition of my book, published when No Time to Die came out, has over 400 pictures, and half of them are in color. I didn't pay a dime for any of them. So it's changed a lot.
I'd like to hear about how you got involved with Criterion. I'm a big Laserdisc and home video fan, so I knew about those early on. I had a Laserdisc player that my roommate sold to me in the mid-90s, and the first Laserdisc I bought was like The Living Daylights and then License to Kill. And I rented, back when you could do that kind of thing, the Criterion Laserdiscs. How did you get involved in the From Russia with Love commentary?
Well, I was approached by David Lee Miller, who I'm happy to say is now one of my writing partners. And David Lee Miller ran the Criterion Collection second soundtrack department. So he was doing those first commentaries before anybody really knew what commentaries were. And so he hired me to do From Russia with Love. I remember it vividly because we were recording that when the Gulf War began. Because there was a knock on the door one night. We were in the middle of our recording and they said the wars began. We ran downstairs and we saw all those anti-aircraft trails flying over Baghdad. The only problem, the problem was that nobody at Criterion had run the idea of doing a commentary soundtrack by Cubby Broccoli. So have you actually listened to the From Russia with Love, the original before it was recalled?
I have listened to all 3.
Yeah, I mean when when Terrence Young is talking about Lotte Lenya and says things like, "Oh, Lotte Lenya, she was in her 70s, but she was still screwing like crazy." I'm sure when Cubby Broccoli heard that, if he didn't fall off his chair, he probably wanted to shoot somebody. So, and there were comments that were very, very unedited comments, which make, of course, those discs so classic because they're not edited. But they were furious. So they forced Criterion to withdraw or recall all those discs. And David technically fired me. He had to replace me with it's not that I was persona non grata at Eon, but I think they kind of were uncomfortable that I was the commentator. So they replaced me with a guy who gave a general commentary thing. They removed all of what they called the questionable commentary.
Well, as an aside, I found a website in late 2011 that had the audio commentaries, and I listened to all 3. And I did a post on this, it wasn't called the Spy Command then, but I did a post. And actually the reactions, the comments to the post were more interesting than my post, because my reaction was like, what's the fuss? I mean, yeah, there's some little colorful phrasing here and there, but it's not like anyone saying, yeah, these movies are crap. There's nothing like that. But as Steve says, there were some very colorful comments. And Steve was actually one of the people who commented, and others did as well, about how they hadn't gotten any permission. So
Yeah, it was a tactical blunder. Of course, when the discs got recalled, the ones that had been purchased became collector's items. And I think I have my From Russia with Love disc around here somewhere. I never had a laser player, so I basically never ran it. But I know that lasers were very popular for many years before, obviously, DVD came out.
What was the process like making it? Did you travel somewhere to interview the people? I imagine it wasn't all done in a room with everyone together. It seems like it's kind of pieced together from different interviews.
David Miller collected interviews from all over the world. So I don't think I'm not sure if Maybaum was probably interviewed in LA because that's where he lived. But they sent people to London and wherever. And then by the time I was brought on, all of the interview material had been done, but they needed somebody to come in and link it and give some context. So that's what I was brought on to do. By the way, Bill, I'm telling you about my encyclopedia. I forget that you contributed to my encyclopedia.
I gave a quote,
which was warmly appreciated.
Yeah. Well, and I meant it. Because I honestly believe your book was one of the first, and I outlined at the start of this recording what some of the others were. I mean, in the 1980s, I really think Bond fandom grew up. That's how I phrased it. And because you mentioned the John Brosnan book. It was a good book for its time, but was basically a book length movie review.
Yeah, it was like a celebration of Bond. It didn't.
Yeah.
And by the way, I met John when I went over to London that year, and really nice guy. He subsequently had done a book on special effects, which was a good little book as well. But when you're deciding what to write, I've always tried to figure out something that would reach the most people. And Bond was ripe for the taking in 1977 when I started. Nobody was doing anything, especially not the type of research I had done at Cinefantastique.
Yeah, and again, your books, I didn't mention his name. Lee Goldberg did the Starlog interview feature story about Richard Maybaum, and the Raymond Benson James Bond Bedside Companion. At the time, that it was like, at that point, the Bond series had been going for 20 years. And like, for a lot of Bond fans, I think eyes were opened, like, oh, that's what it was like. And let me ask you about one thing that your book, the James Bond films, first mentioned that I wasn't aware of, which was how Broccoli and Saltzman at one point had kind of like reached a divide where they were like alternating being the lead producer. So like, for example, with Live and Let Die, that was a Harry Saltzman deal mostly. Cubby was around sometimes on the set, but Live and Let Die was really Harry's farewell, more or less. When you were researching that book, was there any particular surprise, something like, I had no idea this was how it was?
Everything. Literally. I knew nothing about the making of the Bonds when I started. I mean, everything that I learned from Terrence, from Maybaum, from Hunt, from Cubby. I even got a chance to interview Harry, but it was a funny interview because I get to the Beverly Wilshire Hotel to interview Harry Saltzman, and he informs me that because he's in litigation with Cubby, he can't talk about Bond. So we spent an hour talking about vaudeville. Harry's beginning out of as a vaudeville producer finding acts, which is interesting because in many ways his responsibility in the Bond series was to bring things that he was reading about in popular mechanics or popular science. A lot of the innovation in terms of gadgetry was inspired by some of the things Harry was looking for, kind of using the same techniques he used to find talent for his vaudeville act. So there wasn't entirely useless information, but I regretted that I never was able to sit down and talk to him about the Bond movies. But Cubby kind of rescued him. As we all know, Harry had like 28 days left on his option, and it was going nowhere. And Cubby had the connection to United Artists that Harry didn't have.
Javi, do you have any thoughts?
Did you ever get to interview Barbara Broccoli at all from back then? I mean, she was barely, she wasn't back then when you were making the book what she became. But did you have any interactions with her or any insights that you gleaned from maybe seeing her working on anything?
No, not really. I've had virtually no connection to Barbara. She has been very cordial, though. I think it was John Cork told me that when I was bringing out the second edition of the encyclopedia in 95, Barbara was actually thinking of letting me use certain stills, although I ended up finding material elsewhere. And interestingly enough, in the wake of what's happened in the last month or so, knowing that Barbara has other interests than James Bond, she wants to make other kinds of movies, I actually pitched her a comedy that we're writing. And I got a very nice letter back that she's pretty much booked for the next 2 years, but thanked me for the pitch. So I think my relationship with Barbara is fine. I mean, Michael, oh, I forgot to mention something. I mentioned the problems I had with Cubby on the interview transcripts, but Fred Clark, who was the editor of Cinefantastique, was always a good friend, and I miss him terribly because he passed back in the 80s. When he found out I was having some trouble with Cubby on the photographic stills, without consulting me, he takes out an ad in Cinefantastique with Cubby Broccoli in a telescopic gun sight with the headline, "Who is this producer and why does he want this book stopped?" And Michael Wilson saw me in the parking lot at MGM one day, and he told me that was a really cheap shot, Steve, and he wouldn't talk to me again in his life. So basically, Fred cut my legs off with Michael, wow. And that was the end of that. But it's often, things happen that are completely beyond your own control. If Fred had asked me, by the way, you want me to take out an ad with Cubby and the gun sight? I would have said, absolutely not. I have a thin line of relationship with these guys. I don't want to lose it. Well, after that broke, that line was snapped.
Oh, that's really unfortunate.
Steve, let me ask you this, going back to the beginning with Broccoli and Saltzman, because Saltzman had the option. It was a 6-month option. They did the deal with United Artists in the 6th month of the option. Broccoli had the studio connections that Saltzman didn't have, but it's like it wouldn't have happened without the two of them. So what's your evaluation of what each brought to the early Bond films?
That's a good question. I think that passion was there. Both of them saw the value of the series. I think Harry was a live wire. I mean, he was a mile a minute guy. I can't think of two guys who were more different in terms of their personas. Cubby's very low key. He's not a guy who's going to stand up on a table and yell to the masses. Harry would do that in a hot second. So they were very mismatched. But I believe they both shared a great love for Ian Fleming's work, and I think that propelled the series. I'm sure that at times Harry irritated Cubby because of being a little wild and crazy, and also wanting to do other things that Cubby wasn't interested in. They were mismatched, but they were passionate.
I find it fascinating how Cubby Broccoli hooked up with two, as you put it, live wire partners, Irving Allen in the 50s and Harry Saltzman in the 60s. Because it was Irving Allen, it was 1957, had the lunch with Ian Fleming, insults him. Oh, your books aren't even good enough for television and all that stuff.
By the way, Bill, how stupid was Irving Allen that day to say that in front of Ian Fleming? I mean, obviously the guy needed a zipper in his mouth. I think the tragedy is that Cubby could not be at that meeting because he was in New York doing some deals. If Cubby had been there, there's a possibility that he would have taken Irving Allen in the next room and whopped him.
Well, and then oddly, Irving Allen had egg on his face after that meeting, and the Bond series is taken off. It's like, oh crap, I let this get away from me. What spy property can I find? Oh, he gets the Matt Helm movies.
It's unfortunate. I mean, I read all of those Donald Hamilton books, and they are terrific books.
They're
And
great
I think
books.
they're great books. And Dean Martin as Matt Helm, hello.
We don't want to go too far afield, but yeah, no, it was, it's like, I mean, I enjoy the Dean Martin, Matt Helm movies for what they are, but it's like, could we not have gotten like a serious adaptation of Donald Hamilton's books?
Well, it's funny because for years, Hollywood has tried to do an American James Bond. I mean, we have certainly Tom Cruise in the Mission Impossible movies is certainly competition. You've got the Jason Bourne movies with Matt Damon. They've done it. I often say today that the competition against James Bond is fierce because a lot of the tricks and production value elements that Bond brought to the series for years are now being duplicated by other movies, and it's very challenging to try to come up with something fresh. Even those car chase movies, The Fast and the Furious and their 19 variations, they after seeing one of those movies, and I watched that Spectre car chase in Rome, I thought it was really dull.
Yeah.
It wasn't a car chase, it was a car drive.
Yeah. And it cost a bloody fortune. I don't know what they were thinking, but I don't envy the new producers, whoever they may be, the task of finding a fresh plot. Interestingly, just so you guys know, I have written to Jeff Bezos this week. I've also written to a couple of his top executives. I've enclosed a copy of my encyclopedia, and I gave them 2 pages of do's and don'ts. And I don't know if anybody will ever read that. It'll end up in the bottom of a round file, but I had some very specific thoughts on the next Bond movies. I was particularly concerned with not diluting the franchise the way Star Wars has done.
Yeah.
Yes. And I would put Marvel in that category as well.
I mean, I understand the desire to run with a bunch of TV shows, but if you think about it, after seeing 19 different Star Wars TV series, do I have a lot of motivation to see a movie? Not really, especially the first 3 movies, which were pretty bad. So I told Bezos, I said, basically, you got to make 3 or 4 Bond movies before you do a series. Get some juice going, get something going.
I can see Javi is like straining at the bit. So you go, Javi.
From a fan perspective, what's been your favorite era from the films? And touching on what you just mentioned with Jeff Bezos, what from that era would you like to see the most in this next iteration of Bond?
Well, the rule of thumb is if you grow up with a certain Bond, he's your Bond. So I grew up with Sean Connery, so I will always be a Connery guy. So Goldfinger and certainly Thunderball was the peak for me. I'd say the first Daniel Craig, as I mentioned. I've always said that Goldfinger is my favorite Bond movie, but I now say that it's a tie between Goldfinger and Casino Royale. So that I was very impressed with Daniel. And even though I mentioned that the movies were uneven, Daniel's always terrific as Bond. He's just he's such a plus. In terms of going forward, I know some people want to go back to the 50s and turn James Bond into a 1950s character. Not going to happen. I don't think young audiences today, the core of your audience is not going to be interested in seeing a 1950s James Bond movie.
Nor will their sponsors.
Right. Exactly. I told Bezos and his team, I said that Bond should be somewhere in his mid-30s to early 40s. I said he probably is a Caucasian guy from the Commonwealth. Don't turn him into an American. There's going to be a lot of pushback worldwide if Bond is suddenly an American actor. I said that Moneypenny and Q obviously should be of a similar age. I kind of told them basically to adhere to the strengths of the series. This is another thing I mentioned that is important, that it is a family series. Even though you don't think of it in the same terms as Disney or Marvel, the Bond movies should never have profanity. They should never have nudity. And the violence should be somewhat contained. I did say one thing though. I said, this is a controversial thing. I grew up in a very sexy Bond series. Bond movies in the 60s were very sexy. Now, starting with the Roger Moore movies, I should say the Pierce Brosnan movies, they got considerably less sexy. And I even wonder if it's okay for me to even say sexy these days in this world we live in. But to me, well, perfect example. In Spectre, you've got Monica Bellucci, one of the most beautiful women in the world, and a teddy, and they barely show her. And I think that, with all due respect to Barbara, I think under her tutelage, the movies got much more violent and less sexy. And I think that, I don't know if a sexy movie today in the 2020s is gonna get some pushback. But that used to be one of the hallmarks of the series. Guys, we ran to the Bond movies because it was very titillating.
Well, it's funny that there's a quote attributed to Harry Saltzman. And I don't know if it was really said by Harry or somebody else, but it was something that Bond films were, can't think of the word now, something for the entire family. It wasn't violence, but, something like that. And in the early Bond films, there was a lot of tough stuff, but then parents took their kids and that in turn generated another generation of fans.
Although I would say that once Roger became Bond in 1973, the movies became much lighter and more spectacular. Yeah. I think that, you can't disparage Roger Moore's contribution to the series. I mean, that generation, which was essentially a new generation of fans who embraced his movies, were really a big factor in Bond being propelled in the 1970s. I think The Spy Who Loved Me, in the year you were born, Javi, was a huge hit. And the movies became more expensive and even more spectacular. Moonraker, Octopussy. But Bond was much lighter then. I would maintain that the way the world was working in the 70s and 80s, that having a dark secret agent, someone caught up in the darknesses that we see with the Craig movies, international terrorism, wouldn't have flown. One of the big questions I often get asked is George Lazenby, how would his movies have done if he had made some more movies? And I would have to say that as much as I love George as Bond, and I think he was just terrific, I don't think that series would have gone as far as it got with Roger under George's tutelage. Because I think George, he was virtually an unknown. Roger brought a lot of good baggage to the part because he was well known from television. He was also one of the most handsome men in Hollywood or in the world.
At the start of the 1982 Oscars ceremony, it was the beginning of the telecast, and they show all the celebrities coming into the theater, and the announcer says, "And here's Roger Moore, perhaps the most handsome man alive. He's here tonight for a special award." That's when Cubby got his Thalberg Award. That was back when Thalbergs were part of the main Oscars ceremony. So it's the most handsome man alive. And the announcer says it with utmost sincerity. He was the same guy who did a lot of Quinn Martin shows. Americans will recognize Quinn Martin, at least of a certain age like me. But anyway.
The Fugitive, a Quinn Martin production.
Actually, he came later. He was like the FBI, a Quinn Martin production. Anyway, but he was a long-time announcer for the Oscars from the early 60s to the early 80s. Steve, I have to ask you, you've touched on this already, but as we record this, we're about a month out from the big announcement that Amazon's taken over creative control of the Bond films. What was your reaction when you heard it? What are your hopes? What are your fears, etc., going forward?
Well, I cheered because I really felt that, and again, Barbara and Michael have done really great work on the series. They've given their all, but like everything, you need a breath of fresh air. You need to bring in a new team The biggest thing, and I didn't mention this earlier, and we'll see how this plays out, is that it opens the door to bringing in an A-list director. Now, Barbara and Michael kind of they emulated their father, Cubby, in that they never wanted to work with a director who would control the movie. They really preferred directors they could control. So you never saw a Tarantino directing a Bond movie, or a Christopher Nolan, or a Steven Spielberg. And I think that now that the series is under Amazon control, they can open up the doors to really creative talent and perhaps take some risks, as long as they adhere to what I said. You can't turn this into an R-rated series, and you can't, lace it with profanity and nudity, because that's going to turn off your family audience. To this day, you can take your 80-year-old grandmother and your 8-year-old to a Bond movie, and they will not be offended.
Javi, I suspect you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I was curious if you caught the recent tribute at the Oscars and what your take was on that, if you did.
I know it got considerable pushback. I thought it was fine. It was a nice tribute. I think that what happened, as I heard, it was a very, very last-minute addition. When it was announced that Amazon would be taking over creative control, they wanted to do something corresponding with Barbara and Michael getting, they got the Thalberg Award, right?
They got the Thalberg Award in November, but they were going to be there because, the way it plays out, the Thalberg comes out in November, but then the honorary Oscars are mentioned in the main Oscar show.
Right.
So they were going to be there.
Right. And so I thought the show, that was fine. I didn't see the negativity some people said about it, that it was kind of slapped together. But I thought the Bond music is such an iconic part of the series that having three singers sing Bond songs was a great little moment. I liked it.
The thing was, one of the singers actually apologized on her Instagram account. Oh, I hit a few flat notes here and there, but she was fine. Like 90% of the audience, if not more, would have not noticed that at all. But there were like Bond fans, like, why didn't they have the original artists perform? Why this, why that? Like you said, Steve, it was very much a last minute deal.
The Oscars are such a lumbering mess at times. It just goes on. I mean, you can't have a 3.5 hour award show. I mean, it's insane. But that's just the way the Oscars are. And I think the other problem with the Oscars is that 2% of the audience had seen the movies. Nora wins Best Picture, which, by the way, is a very good picture. But I don't think anybody in the mainstream had seen it yet. It's a small audience. If I had voted for the Oscar, I would have voted for Wicked, because I thought Wicked was the most fun that year.
Well, we've gone past 40 minutes, so I think we'll put a pin on it. Steve, this has been great. I enjoyed this very much. I think Javi agrees with me.
Yes.
And thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed by us. We appreciate it very much.
I will throw a plug in for my podcasts. Tales from Hollywoodland is actually going to be doing a James Bond night. You can pull it off of Tales from Hollywoodland on your podcast platform. There's also a YouTube channel. We do a whole talk about the world of Bond. I think the fans will enjoy that. And then we'll see what happens with the future of Bond. My other podcast, Steven Jay Rubin, Saturday Night at the Movies, I'm going to try to do some more things like I did with Cubby Broccoli's interview. I have some of my original interviews that I conducted, and the fans seem to like them. So I may try to put those up on the podcast as well.
Do you have anything planned for GoldenEye for the 30th anniversary this year?
I don't have anything planned at the moment. I think I mentioned, you guys will have already aired the show. There's a series of Bond screenings at the old Culver Theater in Culver City. They're going to start featuring. I have a feeling there will be something around GoldenEye. I thought, I don't think Pierce Brosnan gets enough credit. I thought he was a terrific James Bond. I think that he's been overshadowed by Daniel, but I still think Pierce did a great job.
You know what? I'm actually hoping Pierce Brosnan could be the new James Bond ambassador, because I don't think Craig's interested. Roger Moore, when he was alive, he was very much the ambassador. And occasionally, namely, Harris was kind of an ambassador, but, I'm hoping Brosnan can fill that role in the future. So we'll see.
We'll see. Good talking to you guys.
You too. Listen, thanks very much. Javi, thanks for participating. Steve, thank you very much for being a guest. And this has been the 007 Files, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.